This is Scottish Independence Podcast 4, and this is quite a short one we've got for you today. This is just a little interview with James Maxwell, who's a Scottish political journalist who's occasionally in the New Statesman and on Bella Caledonia. And today we just had a little chat about Johann Lamont's speech yesterday and the significance of it. So that's just 10 minutes, and then there's a little something for you at the end. We're on to talk about Johann Lamont's speech yesterday. What do you think that was? Is it the start of a Labour fight back, or was it a massive miscalculation on her part?
I think definitely the latter. First of all, though, it's worth pointing out that she did raise one very important point, and that is that Scotland, with its soft social democratic consensus, can no longer assume that we can deliver Scandinavian-style public services without a Scandinavian-style tax system. That's a legitimate point, and it's one that the SNP has systematically dodged, although, as many commentators were pointing out today, Douglas Daniel included, one of the reasons we can't address the difficult question about tax is that we don't have any control over tax policy, or any meaningful control over tax policy currently. So even playing her strongest card, Johann Lamont let herself down, missed a very significant and important point. But moving on from that, I think what Lamont has essentially done is capitulate to the Tory and Blairite orthodoxy, which has said over the course of the last decade or so that essentially Scotland simply can't afford social democracy. And in that sense, nothing that Lamont said was brave or groundbreaking, as many of her supporters in the Labour Party and in the press have suggested.
I don't know, is she doing this off her own back to impress London, or has she just basically fallen into line, been told to fall in line? Is this the end for independence of Scottish Labour?
I think the principal motivation behind the speech was a desire to win credibility with the pundits, which is something the Scottish Labour Party has sorely lacked in recent years. And for as long as Ian McWhirter says the Labour Party in Scotland can't be taken seriously, then the party members themselves will struggle to take them seriously.
Do you think they're not being taken seriously, or they felt the need to come out with this kind of policy initiative, even though it isn't a new policy, as you've said? Do you think they're just doing this to try and deflect attention from what I said on Twitter the other day, that their only policy at the moment, or for a long time, seems to have been get salmon?
Yeah, well, they may well have been trying to do that if they had actually produced any policies. All Johann Lamont did yesterday was say that it was time to have a debate. We've been having the debate for at least the last 10 years. We've been having the debate about the extent of the Scottish welfare state, the extent to which we should fund Scottish public services for at least the last 10 years, almost certainly longer. So if that was an attempt to deflect from the fact that the Labour Party's only real interest at the current moment is trying to force Alex Salmond off the political stage, then it was a very, very poor attempt indeed, and a failure. But what was really interesting about the speech was that what Lamont did was essentially to bring the Labour Party in Scotland into line with the Labour Party in the UK as a whole, which entirely defeats the point of the internal review that Jim Murphy and Sarah Boyack conducted over the course of the second half of last year, and which concluded at the end of last year, Sarah Boyack saying that they had devolved a parliament but they hadn't devolved a party. So Johann Lamont's claim, if she makes the claim, to be in charge of a party which is distinctively Scottish and reflects distinctive Scottish values, is entirely empty now, because it's not distinctively Scottish. It reflects the views of the UK Labour Party as a whole. And she is, to be fair, in an extremely difficult position. She was charged with the task, essentially, of establishing for Scottish Labour a distinctive identity, not just with regards to the SNP, but with regards to the UK Labour Party. And you have the SNP, which sits slightly to the left of Scottish Labour, and UK Labour, which sits slightly to the right. So if she went left, she would be becoming more like the SNP, and if she went right, she'd be becoming more like UK Labour. It seems like she's done the latter. Neither strategy promised revival or renewal, but I suspect that moving to the left and trying to reoccupy that critical centre-left ground, which lies at the heart of Scottish political culture, would have been a more plausible and probably successful and effective strategy.
So amazingly, but after the demise of the Scottish Socialists, this leaves the SNP as clearly the left party in Scotland.
Yeah.
Although they are still kind of tagged with the tartan Tories thing, which seems bizarre at this point. But
yeah, I mean, if we put the Scottish Greens to one side, then certainly the SNP is the left party in Scotland. But as I said earlier in our conversation, I don't think we can be complacent about the neoliberal streak in SNP economic policy. I mean, clearly their attitude towards public services, towards the welfare state, whereas the attitude of the current generation of SNP leaders was consolidated during the Thatcher years. But it remains to be seen what kind of tax policy an SNP government under either a federal settlement or in an independent Scotland would pursue. And as I suggested earlier, Lamont was right to raise that question.
You've seen the Labour for Independence made a speech at the Rally for Independence on Saturday. Where does this leave them?
Well, I had assumed that the Labour for Independence movement was anyway to the left of the movement, or anyway to the left of the Labour Party as a whole. I mean, I thought if they were more radical on constitutional issues, then they'd probably be more radical on social and economic. So yeah, I mean, the Labour for Independence initiative is an odd one in many respects, because increasingly the Labour Party in Scotland is defined by its unionism. Lamont's speech yesterday reinforces that. So it leaves them in a very difficult position. But nonetheless, I think the independence movement as a whole should be grateful to Labour for Independence for acting as a pressure group within the Labour Party to try and promote more progressive and imaginative thinking on the constitutional issue. I've always thought the solidarity argument was a particularly weak one. First of all, because it confuses the unity of the British state with the unity of the British working class. But secondly, I've never heard a left-wing unionist, and there aren't many of them, explain why a working class person in Manchester has more in common with a working class person in Glasgow than they do with a working class person in Dublin or in France. And if it's true that in order for one country, one working class, say in Scotland, to feel solidarity for and act in solidarity with another country's working class, say in England, they have to share a state, then shouldn't left-wing unionists like Owen Jones, like those in the Scottish Labour Party, be arguing for much greater integration at the European level so that a united European working class can take on the institutions of European capitalism? And anyway, why stop at Europe? Why not extend into Russia? There's something desperately and ridiculously utopian about it all.
But there's also there's a kind of big state socialist argument, but you can perfectly make the case that a small state socialist argument it's much easier to bring about more socialist reforms in a smaller state than it is in a larger state. There's another corresponding argument that they don't seem to want to face up to as well. Although
obviously the experiences of Ireland would suggest that it's not an easy thing to do. But I think much of the rhetoric surrounding solidarity, which emanates from the Labour Party, has its origins in the centralising instinct of the post-war Labour Party. When following the creation of the welfare state of the NHS, there was a huge amount of power invested in central government in London, and it was used to good effect. Unfortunately, those things are being systematically taken apart by central government in London. In the post-war period, London government, you could argue, was a progressive force, a redistributive force. Over the course of the last 30 years, it has been anything but.
Okay, and to finish off today, we'll have our first report from BBC Scotlandshire. The sound quality is not ideal on this, but that's because, due to its relative unimportance, BBC Scotlandshire has given a relatively small budget.
Dozens of Braveheart-crazed nationalists caused havoc in the capital on Saturday as they took part in a rowdy and ill-disciplined march for separation. In scenes reminiscent of the British riots, which destroyed the centres of many British cities in Britain last year, the protesters stormed through the streets of Edinburgh all morning, having rioted earlier in the Meadows. Many had travelled all night to be there and were described as sweaty, smelly, and a bit untidy by one Meadows resident. Shoppers and tourists alike were stunned into silence as the rioters, mainly in fancy dress, sporting Alex Salmon masks or wielding the separatist blue and white saltire flag, forced their way into Princes Street Gardens, where for several hours they mindlessly chanted and danced. Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police, Sir Robert Peel, KGT, OBE, CBE, BBC, said the riot had disrupted the entire centre of Edinburgh. These foul-tempered, potty-mouthed ne'er-do-wells frightened the law-abiding local residents, particularly those from Morningside, who had never seen a separatist before, he said. My officers eventually decided to kettle them in the Norloch, only to discover that many of them had spontaneously kettled themselves already and were enjoying a nice cup of tea and a bun. In the end, we just let them get on with it. It seemed the safest course of action, he added. At the very height of the disturbance, First Minister Alex Salmond had recklessly encouraged the rioters to new plateaus of separatist frenzy by shamelessly giving the impression that Scottish independence was an actual possibility. Salmond deliberately addressed the throng, telling them he believed that just as the skies around Scotland were lit up by meteors last night, this campaign will light up Scotland over the next 2 years. He then went even further, adding, I've spoken to many crowds in these gardens over the last few years, but never to a rally of a scale and breadth and width of this great rally today. This stirred the crowd up of nationalist revellers, by now almost 100 strong, causing them to cheer mindlessly. Some even fainted from sheer rapture as the tangible possibility of freedom finally became too much for them to bear. However, speaking from his palatial home in Surrey, the chairman of the Scottish Affairs Committee, on being kicked out of Europe and never seeing any of your family in England again, Ian Davidson MP, told BBC Scotlandshire, "These Cybernat rioters is just pure plebs. It's high time they learnt their place. They're all just heading for a spreading, if you ask me." Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, commenting from Mauritius, where he's on a fact-finding tour, said, "I knew there would be trouble as soon as I heard that some socialists were intending to attend the march. We threw them out of the Labour Party decades ago, so I know just how dangerous they can be. Thankfully, there are none left in the party now." Boss of the now-defunct Scottish Lib Dems, Wee Willie Rennie, said, "I blame the SNP, but hey, what can you do, eh?" Scottish Labour leader Johann Lamont was unavailable for comment.